intervention have consistently been more successful at reducing recidivism. I put this quote up here because it takes us to that last piece, that last circle about principles of intervention. Ella Tessa, in particular, out of the University of Cincinnati, is probably one of the leading researchers in juvenile justice and criminal justice, and has been doing a lot of research. And as a matter of fact, John Drow is probably one of the oldest researchers in this field, but they've been doing this for a long time. And you'll see these names often as, again, kind of the leading sources about criminology and what we know about what works and what doesn't work. So, that last circle, it comes down to say evidence-based principles for effective intervention. There are 8 evidence-based principles for effective intervention. So to restate this in another way, we said that if you're looking at the big picture and you're saying, I want an effective program, so I have to understand organizational development, I have to understand collaboration, and last but not least, I have to understand these 8 principles of effective intervention. These 8 principles include assessing risk and needs, enhancing motivation, targeting interventions, skill-trained staff, increase positive reinforcement, engage ongoing support, measure relevant processes and practices, and provide feedback. Whether you're a staff person that directly works with youth, or you are a director that is developing programs, the research says you've got to pay attention to these 8 principles. And we'll talk about each of these principles in brief. The first, about the idea about assessing offender risk and needs. Use reliable and validated methods. What this is basically talking about is you have to know who you want in your program, okay, the type of youth that you want in your program, and you better get the right youth in there. And so one of the recommendations is you need to use instruments that help you do that. And I'll talk about the kind of the whys. Whoops. My scenario didn't come up. Oh no, that's on the next one. So that's it. I keep getting the next step of this section. So as it applies to this assessing offender risk, know the intent of your program. You want to make sure that you're targeting the right people, and you want to make sure that you're not part of the problem. And what I mean by part of the problem is this, and this is another important takeaway. The research is very clear about this. I'm going to repeat that. The research is very clear about this. You over-supervise low-risk offenders, and you will increase their probability for reoffending. You under-supervise high-risk offenders, and you will increase their probability for reoffending. So the last thing you want to do is be part of the problem. Make sure you know who you're getting in your programs, and they're the people that you intend to get in your programs, and that you have the resources to address what it is that they need. Make sense? If you over-supervise low-risk offenders, you increase their probability for recidivism. If you under-supervise high-risk offenders, you increase their probability for recidivism. So that's why it's important that you know what your intent of your program is. If the intent of your program is to take low-risk youth, then you better be sure that they're low-risk youth. And the best way to do that is to use assessment instruments, and that you target what it is that's most appropriate for low-risk youth, or vice versa. If you target higher-risk youth, you want to make sure that you're addressing what it is that high-risk youth need. And we'll talk about that as the morning goes on. Who's my smokers in here? Anybody? Either current or past? It's okay to admit. And I'm gonna pick on you. Just so because you're back, just a little bit with me, okay?
I'm recovering.
Okay, well, that's probably a good scenario. This is what I mean by what we're talking about here about enhancing offender motivation. I want to give you a perfect example about enhancing offender motivation. And how long have you smoked?
20 years.
You said that you're currently recovering, so you haven't possibly given it up?
Yeah, about a year.
You gave it up for a year?
Yeah.
Okay. So, all right, bear with me then. Because we need for you to think back on when you were smoking.
Okay.
Works best with that. And you're a smart woman, right? Everybody. Okay. And you've read all the research that says that smoking is bad for your health.
Yes.
How long did you smoke?
20 years.
Okay. Not all the research, but you smoked 20 years. That's a smart woman, right? Okay. And you know that smoking is bad for your health.
Yes, terrible.
Do you have family that have ever said you really need to quit smoking?
Yes.
And did you quit?
No.
No, why not?
I liked it.
You liked it, okay. And knowing the research and having family members tell you and even some kind of outside pressure from family still didn't get you to quit.
Right.
Okay. If I gave you $100 today, or maybe I should say a year ago, if I gave you $100 a year ago, would that get you to quit?
Maybe for a week.
Maybe for a week. If I gave you $500 to quit smoking,
Not long term, but it would maybe 2 weeks.
maybe 2 weeks to go back to smoking, okay? If I gave you $1 million, would you have quit smoking?
Probably not, actually.
Probably not, okay. If I said to you, I'm going to take your firstborn,
Yes.
would you quit?
Yes.
You would absolutely quit smoking.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. My point here, folks, that I'm trying to demonstrate is this idea about the difference between extrinsic and intrinsic motivation. The extrinsic was no matter how much information she knew, no matter how smart she was, no matter how much pressure either myself or someone else applied on her, she wasn't willing to change. Just wasn't there. Intrinsic motivation is finding out what is that tipping point that started to make her change her behavior. It wasn't $100, wasn't even $500, wasn't even $1 million. I had to take away her firstborn child to get that motivation, but guess what? We found the tipping point. So this idea, thanks, Ann. Yay! So this idea about enhancing offender motivation, one of the things that the research has been real clear about is we, as practitioners, can talk ourselves to a blue in the face and tell these people why they need to change and what you're doing to your life. And can't you see? And that's never going to work. There isn't an ounce of research out there that says telling somebody what to do is going to, in fact, create long-term change. What the research does say, though, is that increasing their intrinsic motivation is the only thing that's effective at creating long-term behavior change. So the takeaway here is you have to learn how to increase intrinsic motivation. It's not something we can do here today. It's a whole other session on its own. But that's the kind of the example about understanding the power of enhancing motivation. The idea behind this enhancing motivation is I can't tell you how many times that I said things like, can't you see what you're doing to yourself? You know, I'd say, are you crazy? Are you crazy to have used again? What are you talking? You know, and I walk away feeling like I'm beating my head against the wall. Can't you see? Guess what? They can't see. They don't think like we do. If they thought like we did, they wouldn't be in trouble. That's why we call it antisocial thinking. That's why we call it criminal behavior. But those of us who are pro-social and work in the field go, why don't they get it? We have to understand this idea of criminality. We have to understand this idea about looking through their eyes, rolling with their resistance, looking for leverage or the leverages. I got Anne's leverage, her firstborn child. You know, it's a pretty high leverage, but looking for leverages to begin to cause this discrepancy. Forcing them to choose about, okay, you know, you smoked again this weekend, and so you're going to have to spend some time in jail. How's that work for you? Forcing them to choose versus you're going to jail for 2 days if you smoke. Creating that discrepancy in their brain. That's the concept behind enhancing motivation. Targeting interventions. Targeting interventions is this idea behind you have to understand the risk principle. You have to understand the needs principle. You have to understand responsivity. What the risk principle is, as I said, what are those factors that cause them to be either high risk or low risk? The need principle is what are those elements that I can change? Remember those dynamic factors that I can address and get my arms around. Substance abuse is a good example. Companions is a good example. And the responsivity principle, matching juveniles to the services. This is probably my best example because it just is the easiest example to give. And that is, if you're working with a youth who is extremely an introvert, and you put them in a group and expect them to function, how well will they do? Not well. So when we have cookie-cutter kind of interventions, we're likely setting our juveniles up for failure. So the idea here about matching the juveniles with the appropriate kind of services. And responsivity is this understanding about what can affect that. And, you know, another easy one is if I have someone who doesn't speak English, then I send them to a class that's just English. Another one is if I have someone who can't read or write, and I put them in a group that expects to do lessons. Any of those. The responsivity idea is understanding what they need. This idea about dosage really is about high-risk juveniles. But basically, what the research says is that when we are dealing with high-risk juveniles, keep in mind that you have to keep them busy in pro-social kinds of activities, anywhere from 40 to 70% of their time for the first anywhere from 3 to 9 months. I keep saying that whole idea about the devil's playground. You know, idle hands is the devil's playground. That's the same thing. It's saying if you really want to change them, then we have to keep them. It's that fake it till you make it. Any of those analogies. Again, these are high-risk youth that they're referring to here. And the treatment principle is this integrated treatment into full sentence and sanctions, meaning this is not, getting off easy. This is still holding them accountable. This is still imposing sanctions. This is still imposing incentives. But it's saying you can't let them off the hook. You have to hold them accountable to your program. And if they don't, there has to be some kind of consequences associated with that. And if they know those consequences, that's even better. Again, a training session that's usually all by itself. Coordination of services. Here's a couple of things that I do want you to know. Education programs for low-risk offenders are appropriate. Okay? I hate to tell you, but education programs for high-risk youth are not appropriate. They don't work. I'm not telling you because that's what I'm saying. I'm telling you because that's what the research and evidence is. But if you are working with low-risk youth, here's some of the things that your educational program should include. Describing the consequences of their behavior. The goal setting, the review of the strengths of the youth, explaining what the resources are available, giving an open vehicle to open lines of communication, community groups that present participants with information. So, in other words, when you talk about what works, low-risk offenders, educational kind of groups do work. Low-risk youth. They do not work with high-risk youth. Skill training with direct practice. Took me a long time to figure this one out, but the easiest way to think of this one is you have to train your staff. They have to be skilled. Plain and simple. Don't compromise on staff. Don't compromise to effectively motivate the youth that you're working with, they have to be trained on how to motivate them. It's incredible, the research that says, doesn't matter what program you apply, but if you have highly skilled staff, you can still affect recidivism upwards towards 1/3 or better. Now 1/3 may not sound like a lot, but guess what? If you were able to take 1/3 of the kids out of the diversion center, or 1/3 of the kids from entering back into the system, that's just on the skill of your staff alone. Now equip them with some of this other stuff, and guess what you can do about recidivism? Huge. That goes back to this, managing competent program delivery. Pick good people, provide required training, enhance their skills, and retain only competent providers. You have to measure to make sure that you're getting from your providers what you want. I cannot tell you, again, from just personal experience, how many times you'll say to a provider, are you doing cognitive programs? Yes, absolutely. Can you tell me how you were trained in cognitive? I sat through your 1-hour session on evidence-based principle. Seriously, you have to know who your providers are, and are they giving you what they want? Are they employing evidence-based practice? Provide positive reinforcement. This is one where a lot of people say, come on, they're in trouble. I don't want to go wrapping my arms around Johnny and saying, good job, Johnny. Guess what? Just human behavior in and of itself says that humans respond better to positive reinforcement than to negative. So if you want them to replicate good behavior, then praise them when they demonstrate good behavior. An important concept to understand about evidence-based principles.
And that goes for staff too. I think that's one thing sometimes we forget, is that we focus so much on doing this with our clients that we forget that this applies to staff too. So.
You know, the interesting part about what Monica brought up is you take these 8 principles, for those of you who are managers, and there is what we refer to as parallel practice. All 8 of them apply to your practices with your staff as well. Are you assessing them? Are you skill training them? Are you motivating them? Are you encouraging them? Provide ongoing support. This is another good example of, we talked about what a high influence companions have. You know, who I hang around with is directly correlated to my probability of recidivism. So what do? We say, you can't hang around with Johnny anymore. How long do you think that hole is going to last? If we don't replace those things, if we don't replace those activities or those people with positive influences, it's not going to last. And for a long time we've simply said, don't hang around with them anymore. Or we put it in a court order. You're not allowed to hang around with gang members. So now where they are? Isolated by themselves? Do we do anything to engage them in an ongoing supportive environment? Now, measure relevant processes and practices. I mentioned this earlier. We have to be willing to look closely at our programs to see if they work. And if they don't work, we have to be willing to change them. We have to be willing to evaluate our processes and practices and change it if needed. And last but not least, provide measured feedback. In other words, how many times have you participated or in a research project and never had the privilege of reading the results? You know? They evaluated your program, but you never got to see it. And what this does is that programs that are successful understand that we have to provide that back to the people who are engaged in the process. How critical that is to successful programs. So as we close up this particular session, it's important to realize that you need to find research-based programs that are scientifically shown to work. There's lots and lots of research out there about what works and what doesn't work.
Develop an assessment to identify the most appropriate program for each youth. There's lots of assessments out there. Choose the right one for your program. Implement quality assurance to make sure that what you're doing is working. How are you evaluating it? Conduct outcome evaluations, not just on your programs, but on your staff, on your processes, and provide that feedback that goes along with that. So, your takeaway for number 3, translating these 8 principles. The key to reducing recidivism with research-based programs is competently delivering the service, the employees, the programming, and the monitoring part of it. And last but not least, the outcomes. Lessons learned. Who we put into programs is important. Pay attention to risk. What you target is important. Pay attention to those factors that lead to risk. And how you target is important. Make sure that you're matching the right kind of program with the right kind of youth. And I always like to leave with this quote, and that is, the real question is, once you know the right thing, do you have the discipline to do the right thing? And equally important, stop doing the wrong thing. The last thing that we want to do as a criminal justice entity, and in particular a juvenile justice entity, is to be part of the problem. We want to be part of the solution. So it's incredibly important that you do what works and what's right.